Good evening. Tonight we descend into a story that begins not with rebellion, but with precision. Not with tie-dye and flower power, but with the sterile clarity of a Swiss laboratory and the meticulous hands of a chemist who never imagined his name would become synonymous with revolution. This is the story of a molecule that was meant to heal, that governments tried to weaponize, and that an entire generation claimed as sacrament. But before all of that, before the mind control experiments in windowless rooms, before Harvard professors lost their careers, before Haight-Ashbury became a pilgrimage site, there was only Albert Hofmann, a quiet afternoon in April, and an accidental journey into a territory of human consciousness that no one had mapped before. What you need to understand is that if you had been in the wrong place at the wrong time in the decades that followed, your own mind could have been the battleground, and you probably wouldn't have known you were fighting. So, before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we explore here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's go in. Our story begins in Basel, Switzerland, a city nestled along the Rhine River in a pocket of calculated neutrality. While the world outside marched toward war in the late 1930s, while Europe teetered on the edge of a darkness that would consume millions, inside the laboratories of Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, Albert Hofmann was simply doing his job. He was a methodical man, born in 1906 in the nearby town of Baden, and his life had been shaped by discipline and necessity. As a child, he had wandered the hills surrounding his hometown, developing a deep connection with nature that would stay with him for the rest of his life. But that idyllic childhood was interrupted when his father fell seriously ill. At just 12 years old, Hofmann had to leave school and find work to help support his family. It was his godfather who eventually made it possible for him to return to his education, and Hofmann seized the opportunity with both hands. He studied chemistry at the University of Zurich, earning his doctorate in 1929 at the age of 23. His dissertation focused on the chemical structure of animal shells, specifically chitin, a substance that forms the hard exoskeletons of insects and crustaceans. It was meticulous work, the kind that required patience and precision, qualities that would define his entire career. Upon graduation, Sandoz Pharmaceuticals hired him immediately. The company was expanding its research into medicinal plants, looking to isolate, purify, and synthesize active compounds that could be transformed into pharmaceuticals. It was respectable work, important work, but not the kind that typically made headlines. Hofmann was assigned to work under Arthur Stoll, the founder and director of the pharmaceutical department, a man who had already made significant contributions to the field by deriving ergotamine from ergot fungus. Ergot. Even the word carries a certain darkness. For centuries, this parasitic fungus that afflicted rye crops had been known primarily as a poison, the cause of a dreadful affliction called St. Anthony's fire. In the Middle Ages, entire villages had been struck down by epidemics of ergot poisoning. The symptoms were horrific, gangrenous limbs turning black and withering away, violent convulsions that twisted bodies into impossible shapes, and terrifying hallucinations that convinced sufferers they were being consumed by flames from within. People died screaming. Others lost their arms and legs to gangrene. The lucky ones only lost their minds. But Stoll had discovered that within this dark fungus lay medicinal secrets. Ergotamine, which he had successfully isolated, could stop postpartum hemorrhaging by contracting the uterus. It was a genuine lifesaver, and Sandoz had built a small industry around cultivating ergot on a large scale. In the Emmental Valley and elsewhere in Switzerland, farmers and day laborers were paid to inoculate their rye crops with the fungus, carefully tending these poisonous growths so that they could be harvested for medicine. Hofmann believed there were more secrets hidden in ergot's chemical structure. He began systematically working through lysergic acid derivatives, synthesizing new compounds one by one, testing each for potential therapeutic properties. His goal was to create a circulatory and respiratory stimulant, an analeptic that could help patients with breathing and blood flow problems, but would have no effect on the uterus. He was working in analogy to nicotinamide, another diethylamide compound that functioned as a stimulant. On November 16, 1938, while most of the world's attention was focused on the expanding shadows of fascism and the very real possibility of another world war, Hofmann synthesized his 25th lysergic acid compound. He named it with the dry, functional poetry that scientists favor, Lysergic Acid Diethylamide, LSD 25. The 25 simply indicated it was the 25th substance in this particular series of experiments. The compound was sent to Sandoz's Pharmacological Research Department for testing. The initial results were documented with clinical brevity. When administered to laboratory animals, LSD-25 produced some uterine contracting effects, though they were not particularly remarkable. The animals became restless. Their fur stood on end. They showed signs of agitation, but there was nothing that suggested this was the circulatory stimulant Hofmann had been searching for. By every measurable standard available to 1930s pharmaceutical research, LSD-25 was a failure. Hofmann noted his findings, filed his report with the precision of a man trained to accept dead ends as part of the process, and did what any good researcher would do when confronted with a compound that showed no therapeutic promise. He put the vial of LSD-25 away on a shelf in his laboratory. There it sat, gathering dust, a forgotten molecule in a quiet corner of a quiet lab, while outside the borders of neutral Switzerland, the Second World War consumed the continent. History is full of these quiet moments, these shelved ideas waiting for their time. Penicillin sat in a petri dish for years before anyone recognized its significance. The microwave oven was invented by accident when a researcher noticed a chocolate bar melting in his pocket near a magnetron. Sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones we almost throw away. For 5 years, LSD-25 remained on that shelf. 5 years during which Europe tore itself apart. 5 years during which millions died in camps and on battlefields, while Switzerland maintained its careful neutrality, and Hofmann continued his methodical work on other projects. He isolated and synthesized other compounds. He pursued other leads. He had no reason to think about that 25th lysergic acid derivative that had proven itself useless. But then, on a spring afternoon in 1943, something unusual happened. For a reason he could never fully explain, not even to himself, Albert Hofmann felt a strange compulsion to revisit this failed experiment. He would later describe it as a peculiar presentiment, a hunch that flew in the face of his disciplined scientific mind. Why return to a substance that had already proven itself useless? There was no logical reason, No new evidence had emerged. No colleague had suggested it. There was simply this feeling, this inexplicable sense that perhaps something had been missed. On April 16th, 1943, Hofmann synthesized a new batch of LSD-25. He worked carefully, following the same procedures he had used 5 years earlier, recreating the compound from its base components. It was late afternoon when he reached the final stages of the synthesis. The Swiss spring sunlight streamed through the laboratory windows. Everything was routine, familiar, controlled. And then, quite suddenly, nothing was routine at all. Hofmann began to feel strange, not ill exactly, but unusual. There was a remarkable restlessness, a sensation he couldn't quite place, combined with a slight dizziness that seemed to come from nowhere. These were not symptoms of any chemical exposure he recognized. He tried to continue working, but the sensations grew stronger, more insistent. Something was wrong, though he couldn't identify what. Eventually, he realized he couldn't continue. He would have to stop work and go home. Later, in his report to his supervisor, Arthur Stoll, Hofmann would describe what happened next with the careful language of a scientist trying to document the undocumentable. Last Friday, April 16th, 1943, I was forced to interrupt my work in the laboratory in the middle of the afternoon and proceed home, being affected by a remarkable restlessness combined with a slight dizziness. At home, I lay down and sank into a not unpleasant, intoxicated-like condition, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. In a dreamlike state, with eyes closed, I found the daylight to be unpleasantly glaring. I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense, kaleidoscopic play of colors. After some 2 hours, this condition faded away. How the LSD-25 entered his system, he could only guess. Perhaps he had touched his face, perhaps he had rubbed his eyes. Perhaps a tiny amount had been absorbed through his skin when he handled the compound. Whatever the route of entry, it had been minute, barely measurable, and yet it had been enough to produce effects unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The next morning, Hofmann felt refreshed, clear-headed, but deeply puzzled. As a scientist, he needed to understand what had happened. Had the LSD-25 really caused these extraordinary visions? If so, how was it possible that such a tiny accidental dose could produce such profound effects? There was only one way to find out. He would have to conduct a controlled self-experiment. 3 days later, on April 19th, 1943, Albert Hofmann made a decision that would change the course of cultural history. He would deliberately ingest LSD-25 to confirm whether it had indeed caused his strange experience. But how much should he take? Working from what he knew about other ergot alkaloids, particularly ergotamine, he calculated what he believed would be a very small dose. Just 1/4 of a milligram, 250 micrograms. What Hofmann didn't know, what no one could have known, was that LSD is extraordinarily potent. The threshold dose for psychoactive effects is around 20 to 25 micrograms. He had just taken 10 times that amount. At 4:20 in the afternoon, Hofmann ingested the LSD dissolved in water. He sat down at his laboratory desk and made careful notes in his journal, documenting the time and dose, preparing to observe and record whatever effects might occur. For a while, nothing happened. He continued making notes, maintaining his scientific detachment. Then, around 40 minutes later, the effects began. His journal entries became increasingly difficult to write. The last coherent notation reads, beginning dizziness, feeling of anxiety, visual distortions, symptoms of paralysis, desire to laugh. After that, the handwriting deteriorates into an illegible scrawl. What he was experiencing had moved far beyond his ability to document it systematically. Hofmann knew he needed to get home, but this presented a problem. It was 1943, and wartime restrictions meant that personal automobiles were forbidden on Swiss roads. There was only one option: the bicycle. He asked his laboratory assistant to escort him, and together they began the journey through the streets of Basel to Hofmann's home. That bicycle ride would become legendary, celebrated decades later as Bicycle Day by psychedelic enthusiasts around the world. But for Hofmann, in the moment, it was anything but a celebration. It was a descent into terror. His assistant would later report that they traveled home safely and at a normal pace, but for Hofmann, every pedal stroke carried him deeper into a reality that was fragmenting around him. His perception of time shattered. Minutes stretched into hours. The familiar streets of Basel transformed into alien landscapes. Buildings warped and breathed. Sounds became visible. Colors had texture and weight. Kaleidoscopic images exploded in his vision, layering upon one another in impossible combinations. Every acoustic perception, the sound of a door handle, a passing automobile, his assistant's voice, transformed into optical phenomena, generating vividly changing images with their own consistent forms and colors. The boundaries between his senses had dissolved, and beneath all of this was the fear, the terrible, overwhelming certainty that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Hofmann was convinced he had poisoned himself. He believed he was going insane. He feared he was dying. When they finally arrived at his home and he stumbled inside, his neighbor, a kind woman he had known for years, appeared to him as a malevolent witch. The familiar furniture in his own house seemed to take on grotesque, threatening forms. Everything in the room spun. He could no longer hold himself upright and had to lie down on the sofa. His wife, deeply concerned, called for the house doctor. The physician arrived, examined Hofmann carefully, and found something that must have seemed paradoxical. Apart from extremely dilated pupils, there were no abnormal physical symptoms. Blood pressure was normal, breathing was normal, pulse was elevated, but not dangerously so. By all conventional medical measures, Hofmann was not dying. He was not poisoned, at least not in any way the doctor could detect. This reassurance began to penetrate through Hofmann's terror. Slowly, gradually, the fear started to give way to something else. A sense of wonder, even enjoyment. The visions continued, but now, knowing he was not dying, Hofmann could begin to observe them with something approaching his scientific curiosity. The colors became less threatening and more beautiful. The distortions became fascinating rather than terrifying. He was, he realized, experiencing something utterly unprecedented in his own consciousness. By the next morning, when the effects had fully subsided, Hofmann felt an extraordinary sense of renewal. The world seemed fresh, vibrant, as if he were seeing it for the first time. His senses felt heightened, clarified. There was a profound sense of having returned from somewhere very far away. In his laboratory, Hofmann wrote his report and came to the inescapable conclusion: he had indeed made a significant discovery. LSD-25 was a psychoactive substance of Extraordinary potency, capable of producing dramatic alterations in consciousness with incredibly small doses. This was unprecedented. No other known substance could produce such profound effects with so little material. Hofmann foresaw LSD becoming a powerful tool for psychiatry. Its ability to temporarily alter consciousness so dramatically could, he believed, help researchers understand mental illnesses like schizophrenia. It might allow psychiatrists to temporarily experience something like their patient's reality. It might open new avenues for psychotherapy, allowing patients to access repressed memories or break through psychological barriers. What Hofmann could not imagine, sitting in his quiet laboratory in Basel, was that anyone would use this substance recreationally. It was too intense, too powerful, too deeply introspective. The experience he had just endured had been overwhelming even for a trained chemist who understood he had deliberately ingested a known compound. Who would seek out such an experience for pleasure? Within months, other Sandoz employees volunteered to try LSD 25 under controlled conditions. One of the first was Werner Stoll, son of Arthur Stoll, who worked as a psychiatrist at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Clinic in Zurich. Werner Stoll published the first scientific paper describing LSD's effects in 1947, documenting its ability to produce profound alterations in perception, thought, and emotion. Sandoz, recognizing the potential psychiatric applications, began manufacturing LSD for research purposes under the trade name Lysergic. By 1947, they were providing ampules to qualified researchers around the world. The substance was legal, promising, and surrounded by genuine scientific excitement. Major medical centers in America and Europe began conducting research. Psychiatrists experimented with using LSD to treat alcoholism, anxiety, depression, and other conditions. Some researchers reported remarkable success rates. Through the late 1940s, LSD remained confined to medical and academic settings. It was a therapeutic tool, a research substance, something handled with care and scientific rigor. Albert Hofmann watched this early research with satisfaction. His molecule was fulfilling the promise he had seen in it, helping to unlock the mysteries of human consciousness, providing insights into mental illness, possibly offering relief to suffering patients. But by 1949, samples of LSD were beginning to reach the United States, and not all of those samples would end up in the hands of academic researchers or psychiatrists. Some would find their way to a very different kind of laboratory, one where the goal wasn't healing but control, where the subjects weren't patients but targets, where everything would be done in secret, and where the very concept of informed consent would be abandoned entirely. The molecule was out now, spreading beyond the quiet precision of a Swiss pharmaceutical laboratory. And no one, not Hofmann, not Sandoz, not the early psychiatric researchers, understood yet what had been released into the world. They couldn't have known that in windowless rooms across America, other men were already thinking about this extraordinary substance, not as medicine, but as a weapon. They couldn't have known that the question would soon become not how can this heal, but how can this control? In his Basel laboratory, surrounded by the familiar equipment and chemical compounds of his trade, Albert Hofmann had opened a door that he would never be able to close. The molecule existed now. The knowledge existed. And knowledge, once born, cannot be unborn. It can only be used and the question of how it would be used was about to be answered in ways that would horrify the gentle Swiss chemist who had simply been searching for a circulatory stimulant on a quiet afternoon in April, while Albert Hofmann continued his careful research in Basel, and while legitimate psychiatrists across Europe and America explored LSD's therapeutic potential with genuine scientific curiosity, something else was beginning to happen in the shadows. In unmarked buildings and secret facilities across the United States, a very different kind of research was taking shape. This research would not be published in medical journals. It would not seek to heal. It would not ask for informed consent. Instead, it would ask a single, chilling question. Could the human mind be broken, erased, and rebuilt as a weapon of the state? The Cold War had created a new kind of paranoia, one that infected the highest levels of American intelligence. In the early 1950s, reports began circulating, some later proven false, others exaggerated, that Soviet scientists were developing techniques for brainwashing prisoners. American soldiers captured in Korea were returning home changed, their personalities altered, their loyalties questioned. Some appeared to have been turned by their captors through methods that seemed to bypass ordinary interrogation. The fear was that the Soviets and Chinese had discovered ways to control the human mind, to rewrite personality itself, to create unwitting agents who wouldn't even know they had been compromised. This fear was not entirely irrational. During World War II, both Nazi and Japanese scientists had conducted horrific experiments on human subjects, pushing the boundaries of what the body and mind could endure. Now, in the nuclear age, when the next war might be won or lost, not on battlefields, but through intelligence and psychological operations, the question became urgent. If the enemy had these capabilities, could America afford not to develop them as well? In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency received reports that the Soviet Union had engaged in intensive efforts to produce LSD. There were claims, never fully verified, that the Soviets had attempted to purchase the world's entire supply of the chemical. One CIA officer would later testify that the agency was literally terrified of the Soviets' LSD program, largely because of how little was known about the drug in the United States. In testimony that would only become public decades later, this officer described LSD as the one material that we had ever been able to locate that really had potential fantastic possibilities if used wrongly. The phrase is telling, if used wrongly. Not if used at all, but if used wrongly. The implication was clear. The CIA had already begun thinking about how to use it correctly, not for healing, not for psychiatric research, but for operations. The early precursors to what would become MKUltra had names that sound almost innocent: Project Bluebird and Project Artichoke. Beginning in the early 1950s, these programs sought to develop and test methods of controlling human behavior. They combined various approaches: electroshock therapy, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and increasingly, psychoactive drugs. It was under Artichoke that the agency first began to systematically recruit top researchers and court prestigious institutions to collaborate in mind control research. One of the first Americans to experience LSD was Dr. Robert Hyde, Deputy Director of Boston Psychopathic Hospital. In 1949, the hospital acquired samples of LSD from Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland. Hyde tried the substance himself, then began using it in research, administering it to himself, his colleagues, student volunteers, and hospital patients. In 1952, the CIA began covertly funding Hyde's research. Over the next decade, he would work on 4 separate MKUltra sub-projects, his hospital becoming an early testing ground for what the substance could do to human consciousness. But it was in 1953 that the programs truly crystallized into something systematic and deeply disturbing. On April 13, 1953, CIA Director Alan Dulles gave a speech decrying Soviet brainwashing techniques and warning about the threat they posed to American values. 3 days later, on April 16th, exactly 10 years to the day after Hofmann's accidental LSD experience, Dulles approved the beginning of MKUltra, a top-secret CIA program for the covert use of biological and chemical materials. The man chosen to direct MKUltra was Sidney Gottlieb, a CIA chemist who would later be described as the unwitting godfather of the entire LSD counterculture. Gottlieb was a complicated figure, a club-footed biochemist who kept a cabin in the woods, practiced folk dancing, and grew Christmas trees, yet who would oversee some of the most unethical human experiments in American history. He was brilliant, driven, and utterly convinced that the ends justified the means. In the early 1950s, Gottlieb arranged for the CIA to purchase the entire world's supply of LSD from Sandoz Laboratories for $240,000. A sum equivalent to approximately $4.2 million in today's money. This gave him the ability to conduct experiments on a massive scale. The LSD was distributed through a network of universities, hospitals, prisons, and research institutions, often through bogus front foundations that concealed the CIA's involvement. The methodology of MKUltra was as varied as it was disturbing. Researchers tested LSD on prisoners, psychiatric patients, drug addicts, and ordinary citizens, sometimes with their knowledge, often without. The goal was twofold. First, to understand how LSD could be used to extract information from unwilling subjects, and second, to determine whether it could be used to control behavior or even erase and rebuild personality. At the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, Dr. Harris Isbell conducted experiments that would be considered criminal by any modern standard. In one notorious study, Isbell administered LSD to 7 men, nearly all of them black patients at the facility, for 77 consecutive days. When the patients began to build up tolerance to the drug, Isbell simply increased the dosage, giving them double, triple, and quadruple doses to maintain the effects. The men had no real choice but to participate. They were addicts, dependent on the facility for the drugs that kept their withdrawal symptoms at bay, and they were often promised reduced sentences or better treatment in exchange for their cooperation. The story of William Henry Wall Sr. illustrates the human cost of these experiments with devastating clarity. Wall had been a respected doctor in the small town of Blakely, Georgia, where he had even established the first local hospital. But following a dental procedure in the late 1940s, he was prescribed Demerol for pain. Though it was thought to be non-habit forming, he became addicted. Despite his addiction, he continued to practice medicine for several years. But in 1953, he was arrested on federal drug charges, convicted, and sentenced to serve his time at the Public Health Service Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, the same facility where Dr. Isbell conducted his LSD experiments. Wall became one of Isbell's subjects. The LSD he was given there, combined with other experimental treatments, would eventually drive him to insanity, His son, William Henry Wall Jr., would later write a book called From Healing to Hell, documenting how the experiments changed his father's mental state and inevitably destroyed his life and their family. The experiments weren't confined to prisons and hospitals. In one of the most surreal operations, the CIA hired George Hunter White, a federal narcotics agent with a reputation for living on the edge of, and often beyond, the law. White was known for his heavy use of alcohol and narcotics, the very substances he was supposed to be controlling. He had a particular animosity toward jazz musicians and had pursued Billie Holiday with what seemed like personal vendetta, later saying that the way she flaunted her furs and her big cars was offensive to him. Gottlieb hired White to run what became known as Operation Midnight Climax. In safe houses in New York and later San Francisco, White would lure men off the street, often soliciting prostitutes to help bring them in, and then dose them with LSD without their knowledge. White and other CIA officers would watch from behind one-way mirrors, observing how the unwitting subjects behaved under the influence, how they might be manipulated, what information they might reveal. The safe houses were decorated to look like ordinary apartments, but they were actually elaborate observation posts where American citizens were drugged and studied like laboratory animals. The justification, always, was national security. The belief was that if the Soviets had these capabilities, America needed them too. But the cost in human suffering was immense and still not fully calculated. Perhaps the most horrifying experiments were conducted by Dr. D. Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada. Cameron was chairman of the Department of Psychology at McGill University and a respected psychiatrist. Under MKUltra funding, he developed techniques he called psychic driving and depatterning. The goal was to erase existing patterns of behavior and thought, reducing patients to a blank slate, and then to rebuild their personalities from scratch. Cameron's methods were brutal. Patients, often people who had come to him seeking treatment for relatively minor problems like anxiety or postpartum depression, were subjected to massive doses of electroshock therapy, far beyond what was considered acceptable even by the loose standards of the era. They were kept in drug-induced sleep for weeks at a time. They were isolated in sensory deprivation chambers, and they were given LSD, often in combination with other drugs, while recorded messages played repeatedly, sometimes for 16 to 20 hours a day, attempting to imprint new patterns of thought. Some patients lost years of memory. Some forgot their spouses and children. Some lost the ability to perform basic tasks like using a toilet or feeding themselves. They had come seeking help for minor problems and left as shells of who they had been. Cameron died in 1967, and his family destroyed his personal records, making a full accounting of his work impossible. But the patients he destroyed and their families would spend decades seeking acknowledgement and compensation for what had been done to them. The deep irony of MKUltra is that while it was being conducted in secret, with the goal of creating tools for intelligence operations, it was inadvertently seeding the very counterculture movement that would soon threaten everything the CIA stood for. Many of the people who volunteered for early LSD experiments, believing they were participating in legitimate psychological research, found the experience profoundly meaningful and told their friends about it. Ken Kesey, who would later write One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and become a central figure in the psychedelic movement, received his first dose of LSD as a volunteer in a CIA-funded experiment at a Veterans Administration hospital in Menlo Park, California, in 1959. He was a student at nearby Stanford University at the time, earning extra money as a paid test subject. Robert Hunter, who would become the lyricist for the Grateful Dead and help shape the sound and philosophy of an entire generation, also received his first LSD through CIA-funded research. Allen Ginsberg, the poet who would preach the value of psychedelic experience and become a voice of the counterculture, got his first dose from a Stanford University campus experiment, where he could listen to records of his choice while under the influence. He chose Gertrude Stein, a Tibetan mandala mantra, and Richard Wagner. He later said the experience resulted in a slight paranoia that hung on all my acid experiences through the mid-1960s until I learned from meditation how to disperse that. Years later, after learning that the experiment had been CIA-funded, Ginsberg would write, "Am I, Allen Ginsberg, the product of one of the CIA's lamentable, ill-advised, or triumphantly successful experiments in mind control?" The question was rhetorical, but genuinely unsettling. Had the CIA, in trying to develop weapons, actually created the philosophical leaders of a movement dedicated to consciousness expansion and opposition to government authority? Throughout the 1950s and into the early 1960s, MKUltra expanded to include approximately 150 separate sub-projects. Universities including Stanford, Cornell, and Columbia received funding. Hospitals and research centers across the country participated, often without knowing the true source of their grants. Prisoners at state and federal facilities, patients at mental institutions, soldiers at military bases, all became test subjects in a vast experiment whose full scope would not be known for decades. The experiments continued even as evidence mounted that the central premise was flawed. By the early 1960s, it was becoming clear that LSD and other psychoactive drugs did not, in fact, provide reliable methods for extracting information or controlling behavior. The effects were too unpredictable, too dependent on set and setting, too influenced by individual psychology. A person under the influence of LSD might become extremely suggestible, or they might become paranoid and resistant. They might confess to anything, or they might retreat into their own internal landscape and become unreachable. There was no consistency, no reliability, no way to weaponize the substance in the way Gottlieb and others had hoped. Sidney Gottlieb himself eventually reached this conclusion. After more than a decade of experiments, after millions of dollars spent, after countless lives disrupted or destroyed, he admitted that the entire project had been based on a fantasy. Mind control, he was forced to conclude, was a myth. It was something from science fiction, not something that could be achieved through chemistry or psychology. The human mind was far more resilient, far more complex than the CIA had understood. In 1964, Gottlieb ordered MKUltra to be wound down, but the cover-up was already beginning. In 1973, with the Watergate scandal creating a government-wide panic about what secrets might be revealed, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files destroyed. Most were incinerated, shredded, lost to history. It was only through a bureaucratic accident that approximately 20,000 documents survived. They had been incorrectly stored in a financial records building and were discovered in 1977, following a Freedom of Information Act request. Those surviving documents, examined during the church committee hearings and other investigations in the mid to late 1970s, revealed a program of staggering scope and ethical bankruptcy. They showed universities on the CIA payroll, respected researchers conducting experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics, patients and prisoners used as guinea pigs without their knowledge or consent. But the destroyed documents, the vast majority of MKUltra records, meant that a full accounting would never be possible. How many people were subjected to unwitting experiments? No one knows. How many lives were permanently damaged? The number is uncertain. How many died? That too remains unknown. Frank Olson, an army biochemist, fell from a 10th-story window in 1953, days after being secretly dosed with LSD by a CIA operative. His death was ruled a suicide, but his family spent decades fighting for the truth, convinced he had been murdered. Other deaths were never investigated at all. What is certain is that the CIA's experiments with LSD created a legacy of trauma and mistrust. When the programs were finally exposed in the 1970s, they became evidence of government willingness to sacrifice individual rights for perceived national security interests. They showed that the rhetoric about American values, the very values Dulles had invoked when authorizing MKUltra, could be discarded when convenient. And perhaps most ironically, the experiments helped create exactly what they had been meant to prevent. By introducing LSD to people like Kesey, Ginsberg, and Hunter, intelligent, articulate people who then spread the word about their experiences, the CIA had planted the seeds of a cultural revolution. The drug that was supposed to be a tool for controlling minds became instead a catalyst for questioning authority, rejecting conformity, and seeking alternative forms of consciousness. In windowless rooms and secret laboratories, the CIA had tried to turn LSD into a weapon, but the molecule, indifferent to human intention, had other plans. It was already spreading beyond the government's control, entering university campuses, finding its way into the hands of researchers who saw in it not a tool for domination, but a key to understanding the deepest mysteries of human consciousness. At Harvard University, a psychologist named Timothy Leary was about to encounter psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico and begin a journey that would make him the most famous advocate for psychedelic experience in history. He would transform LSD from a psychiatric research tool and a government secret into a cultural phenomenon. And in doing so, he would help ensure that Hofmann's molecule would become known not for what governments tried to make it, but for what a generation of young people believed it could be: a sacrament of consciousness, a rebellion against control, a doorway to freedom. The Sedated IA had asked, how can we control minds? But the question the culture was beginning to ask was entirely different. What if minds don't need to be controlled? What if they need to be freed? While the CIA's experiments continued in their secret facilities, while patients in Montreal were being stripped of their memories and identities, another story was beginning, one that would unfold not in shadows, but in the supposed light of academic inquiry, and one that would ultimately have far greater impact on American culture than anything Sidney Gottlieb ever achieved. In the summer of 1960, Timothy Leary was a conventional academic success story on the verge of personal collapse. Born in 1920 in Springfield, Massachusetts, the son of a U.S. Army officer, Leary had followed a winding path through Catholic schools, military academy, the University of Alabama, and finally to Berkeley, where he earned his doctorate in psychology in 1950. He had spent the 1950s building a respectable career as a researcher, focusing on the interaction between personality and social relationships. By 1959, he had accepted a lecturing position at Harvard University's Center for Research in Human Personality. He was exactly the kind of serious, credentialed scientist that institutions valued: intelligent, productive, ambitious. But beneath the professional success, Leary was unraveling. His first wife, Marianne, had killed herself in 1958, leaving him with 2 small children and a grief he didn't know how to process. He had tried to continue as if nothing had changed, throwing himself into his work, but the foundation of his life had cracked. By the summer of 1960, exhausted and searching for something he couldn't name, Leary decided to take a break. He rented a villa in Cuernavaca, Mexico, a beautiful colonial city known for its eternal spring weather and its expatriate community of artists and intellectuals. It was there, in that villa on a warm afternoon, that a woman named Geraldine offered him some mushrooms. Not the kind you put on pizza, she explained, but hongos, magic mushrooms, Psilocybe mexicana, the same species that had been used for centuries in indigenous Mexican religious ceremonies. Leary, curious and perhaps reckless in his grief, agreed to try them. What happened next would change the trajectory of his life and, in time, American culture itself. The mushrooms produced what Leary would later describe as a profound religious experience, a sense of ego dissolution and cosmic connection unlike anything he had encountered through years of academic psychology. He felt, for the first time since his wife's death, a sense of peace and meaning. The experience convinced him that there were vast territories of human consciousness that Western psychology had completely ignored, and that these territories could be accessed through psychoactive substances. When Leary returned to Harvard for the fall semester, he was a man with a mission. He sought out and found a kindred spirit in Richard Albert, a young assistant professor who was himself searching for something beyond conventional academic achievement. Albert, who would later become famous under the name Ram Dass, came from a wealthy Jewish family and had all the markers of success: degrees from Tufts, Wesleyan and Stanford, positions at Harvard in 4 different departments, but felt an emptiness that achievement couldn't fill. Together, Leary and Albert founded what became known as the Harvard Psilocybin Project. Their goal, at least initially, was legitimate scientific research. They wanted to study the effects of psilocybin on human consciousness, to document what happened when carefully selected subjects took the substance under controlled conditions, to see whether there might be therapeutic applications. Leary reached out to Aldous Huxley, the renowned British author who had written The Doors of Perception in 1954, describing his own experiences with mescaline. Huxley had been exploring psychedelics since 1953, when psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond had introduced him to the substances, and he agreed to serve as a consultant to the Harvard Project. Through Huxley's connections, Leary was able to secure a supply of synthetic psilocybin from Sandoz Laboratories, the same Swiss company that was producing LSD. The research began with graduate students and willing volunteers, people who were carefully screened and prepared for the experience. Leary developed what he called the set and setting philosophy, the idea that the experience produced by psychedelics was heavily influenced by the mindset of the person taking them, the set, and the environment in which they took them, the setting. With proper preparation and a supportive environment, he believed, psychedelics could produce profound insights and potentially lasting positive changes. The early research seemed to support this. In the Concord prison experiment, Leary and his team administered psilocybin to inmates at a Massachusetts prison, combining it with intensive group therapy sessions. The initial results suggested reduced recidivism rates. Prisoners who participated seemed less likely to return to prison after release. In the Marsh Chapel experiment, also known as the Good Friday experiment, theology students were given psilocybin in a chapel on Good Friday, while a religious service was broadcast over speakers. Many of the participants reported profound mystical experiences that they ranked among the most significant spiritual events of their lives. But even as the research produced interesting results, problems were emerging. Other Harvard faculty members began to question the rigor and ethics of what Leary and Albert were doing. There were concerns about whether proper protocols were being followed, whether subjects were truly giving informed consent, whether the researchers were maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. Because Leary and Albert weren't maintaining those boundaries, they were taking psilocybin and LSD themselves, often during the research sessions with their subjects. They were having profound personal experiences that convinced them these substances were not just research tools, but keys to human liberation. The line between scientific investigation and personal exploration was blurring, then disappearing entirely. By 1962, Leary had moved beyond psilocybin to LSD, which Sandoz was still providing to researchers. The effects of LSD were more intense, longer lasting, and in Leary's view, even more revelatory than psilocybin. He began to see his work less as psychology and more as a kind of missionary activity. He wasn't just studying consciousness, he was trying to expand it, to free it from what he saw as the constrictive norms of conventional society. The Harvard administration grew increasingly alarmed. Reports reached them that Leary and Albert were pressuring students to participate in experiments. There were accusations that they were giving drugs to undergraduates, which they had explicitly agreed not to do. The research was becoming less systematic, more chaotic, more focused on personal transformation than on generating publishable data. The end came through the efforts of a student named Andrew Weil, who would later become famous as an integrative medicine advocate and wellness guru, but who in 1962 was an undergraduate writing for the Harvard Crimson. Weil investigated the psilocybin project and revealed that Albert had indeed given drugs to an undergraduate in his apartment, in direct violation of the agreement with the university. The scandal was exactly what the Harvard administration needed to act. In May 1963, both Leary and Albert were dismissed from Harvard. Leary's contract was not renewed because he had failed to fulfill his teaching obligations. He had spent more time promoting psychedelics than actually showing up to teach his classes. Albert was fired outright for the undergraduate incident. Their academic careers, which had seemed so promising just a few years earlier, were over. But if Harvard thought that firing Leary and Albert would end their influence, they badly miscalculated. The dismissal became news. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the Harvard professors who had been experimenting with mind-altering drugs. For many people, particularly young people who were already questioning authority and conventional wisdom, the story made Leary and Albert not pariahs, but heroes, martyrs to a hidebound establishment that feared new ideas. Leary, in particular, seemed to thrive on the notoriety. If he couldn't spread his message through academic journals, he would spread it through the culture at large. He began giving lectures at colleges and universities across the country, speaking to packed auditoriums about the potential of psychedelics to transform human consciousness and society. His charisma, his gift for memorable phrases, and his willingness to present complex ideas in accessible terms made him enormously popular on the college circuit. The next phase of Leary's journey began when he found unlikely patrons in the heirs to the Mellon fortune. Peggy, Tommy, and Billy Hitchcock were young, wealthy, and interested in consciousness exploration. They owned a 64-room mansion on a 2,500-acre estate in Millbrook, New York, and they offered it to Leary and Albert as a base for continuing their work outside the constraints of academia. The Millbrook estate became a legend in its own right, a kind of psychedelic utopia where ideas about consciousness, spirituality, and social transformation could be explored without institutional oversight. Leary established the Castalia Foundation, named after the intellectual colony in Hermann Hesse's novel, The Glass Bead Game. The foundation published the Psychedelic Review and hosted weekend retreats that combined LSD sessions with meditation, yoga, and group therapy. Despite Millbrook's reputation for wild abandon, and there were certainly parties, breakdowns, dramatic personal conflicts, and more than a few genuine crises, Leary's approach to LSD use was still relatively structured during this period, at least compared to what was happening in the broader culture. He emphasized the importance of careful set and setting, of having experienced guides present during sessions, of integration work afterward to process and understand the experiences. But Leary's philosophy was evolving away from the therapeutic model and towards something more spiritual and increasingly political. He began talking about LSD not as a psychiatric tool or even as an aid to personal growth, but as a sacrament, a key to religious experience. In 1966, he founded the League for Spiritual Discovery, declaring LSD to be its holy sacrament. This was partly a sincere expression of his beliefs. He genuinely saw psychedelic experiences as religious in nature, but it was also a legal strategy, an attempt to claim First Amendment protection for LSD use based on freedom of religion. Around this time, Leary began articulating the philosophy that would become his trademark. In September 1967, at a gathering of 30,000 people in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park called the Human Being, he spoke the phrase that would define his public image: turn on, tune in, drop out. The phrase was deliberately provocative, designed to capture attention, but Leary later explained that it had a more nuanced meaning than most people understood. Turn on meant to activate your neural and genetic equipment, to go within and discover your own consciousness. Tune in meant to interact harmoniously with the world around you, to find your place in the broader ecology of existence. Drop out meant self-reliance, detachment from involuntary commitments, finding your own path rather than following the one prescribed by society. But the nuance was lost in the cultural moment. Most people, including many of Leary's followers, heard turn on, tune in, drop out as a simple directive, get high, and abandon responsibility. Leary himself later expressed disappointment that people thought he meant get stoned and abandon all constructive activity. But by then, the phrase had taken on a life of its own. Leary's celebrity continued to grow. He appeared on television programs, gave countless interviews, and befriended musicians and artists. John Lennon and Yoko Ono invited him to their bed-in for peace in Montreal. When Leary announced his intention to run for governor of California against Ronald Reagan in 1970, Lennon wrote "Come Together" as a campaign song. The song's opening line, "He got juju eyeball," was supposedly a reference to Leary's intense gaze. Lennon's previous song, "Tomorrow Never Knows," from the Beatles' 1966 album Revolver, had been directly inspired by Leary's book, The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which Leary had co-authored with Ralph Metzner and Richard Alpert. The book attempted to create a guide for navigating LSD experiences using the structure of the Bardo Thodol, the Tibetan text traditionally used to guide the consciousness of the dying through the stages of death and rebirth. Leary's appropriation of Eastern spiritual texts to explain Western drug experiences was characteristic of the era's syncretism, its willingness to borrow from any tradition that seemed to offer wisdom. But even as Leary's cultural influence reached its peak, the backlash was building. In 1966, he testified before a Senate subcommittee in Washington, D.C., and recommended that colleges authorize laboratory courses in psychedelics. He predicted these would be probably the most popular and productive courses ever offered in any educational institution, because here we are opening the mind, not just teaching concepts to students. The senators were not persuaded. To them, Leary represented everything that was going wrong with American youth: disrespect for authority, abandonment of traditional values, embrace of hedonism disguised as spirituality. President Richard Nixon, who saw in the counterculture a threat to the social order he was trying to preserve, called Leary the most dangerous man in America. The designation was both absurd and revealing, more dangerous than actual criminals, than violent extremists, than foreign adversaries. What made Leary so threatening was not that he was violent, but that he was influential. He was encouraging young people to question everything, to seek their own truth, to reject the paths their parents and society had laid out for them. In an era when the government needed young men to accept being drafted to fight in Vietnam, when it needed citizens to accept without question the rightness of American foreign policy, Leary's message of "turn on, tune in, drop out" was indeed dangerous, not to individuals, but to the establishment's ability to maintain control. The authorities came after Leary with a vengeance. In 1965, he was arrested in Laredo, Texas, when border agents found marijuana in his car. The arrest should have been relatively minor, possession of a small amount, but Leary was sentenced to 30 years in prison and a $30,000 fine. The severity of the sentence reflected not the crime, but the person. Psychiatry wanted to make an example of him. Leary fought the case through the appeals process while continuing his advocacy work. In 1968, he was arrested again, this time in Laguna Beach, California, for possession of marijuana. More charges, more legal battles, more fines. By 1970, after exhausting his legal appeals, Leary was finally sent to a minimum security prison in California. But Leary wasn't ready to become a martyr. In September 1970, in one of the more spectacular escapes in American prison history, he climbed along a cable above the prison yard, scaled a fence, and fled to a waiting car. The escape had been facilitated by the Weather Underground, the radical left-wing organization that had concluded Leary was being held as a political prisoner. They helped him escape to Algeria, then to Switzerland, then to Afghanistan, all while he remained a fugitive from American justice. The exile lasted until 1973, when Leary was captured in Afghanistan and returned to California. He spent the Sedated next 3 years in various prisons, including a stint in Folsom State Prison, where he was housed near Charles Manson, the two men whose names had become synonymous with the dark side of the 1960s, one for psychedelics, one for murder, were neighbors in confinement. Leary was finally released in 1976, his sentence reduced partly because he had provided information to authorities about the Weather Underground and other radical groups. This cooperation destroyed his reputation among many in the counterculture, who saw him as having betrayed the movement. His defenders argued he had simply done what was necessary to survive and regain his freedom, but the damage to his image was lasting. Meanwhile, Richard Alpert had taken a very different path. After his dismissal from Harvard, after the years at Millbrook, Alpert had traveled to India in search of spiritual understanding. There he met Neem Karoli Baba, a Hindu guru who gave him the name Ram Das, servant of God. When Alpert returned to America as Ram Das, he brought with him a different message than Leary's. His 1971 book, Be Here Now, became a countercultural Bible, but its emphasis was on meditation, yoga, and traditional spiritual practice rather than on psychedelics. Ram Das acknowledged that LSD had opened a door for him, had shown him that expanded consciousness was possible. But he came to believe that sustaining that consciousness required discipline and practice, not chemical shortcuts. The divergent paths of Leary and Ram Dass illustrated a fundamental split in how people understood psychedelic experiences. Was LSD itself the point, the sacrament that needed to be repeatedly consumed? Or was it a catalyst, something that could show you possibilities, but that ultimately needed to be set aside in favor of other practices? The question remained unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable, because different people genuinely seemed to have different experiences and draw different conclusions. What was indisputable was that Leary, for better and worse, had made LSD central to 1960s counterculture. He had taken a molecule that existed in laboratory flasks and turned it into a cultural symbol, a rallying point, a dividing line between establishment and underground, between those who accepted society's rules and those who rejected them. His genius for publicity, his willingness to be provocative, his charisma and articulateness had made him the face of psychedelic experience for millions of Americans who never took LSD themselves, but who formed their opinions about it largely based on what they knew of Timothy Leary. And that was the tragedy, because Leary's recklessness, his lack of concern for potential harm, his tendency to make grandiose claims without nuance or caveats, had also poisoned the well for serious research. When mainstream America looked at LSD, they didn't see the careful therapeutic work being done by psychiatrists like Humphrey Osmond and Sidney Cohen. They saw Timothy Leary telling kids to turn on and drop out. They saw a Harvard professor who had thrown away his career and was now encouraging others to throw away theirs. They saw chaos, rebellion, threat. The LSD that Leary promoted was no longer the therapeutic tool Hofmann had envisioned, or even the consciousness-expanding sacrament that early advocates like Huxley had described. It had become political, a statement of opposition to everything the establishment represented. And when something becomes that political, that culturally charged, rational discussion becomes nearly impossible. By the mid-1960s, the stage was set for prohibition. The government had tried to use LSD as a weapon and failed. Harvard had tried to use it as a research tool and had seen that research devolve into scandal. And now Leary had made it a symbol of generational rebellion, which meant that the establishment had to respond. The molecule that Hofmann had accidentally discovered was about to become illegal, not because of what it actually did, but because of what it had come to represent. In Haight-Ashbury, in college dorm rooms, in communes and crash pads across America, young people were already taking LSD by the thousands, experimenting with consciousness, seeking alternatives to the lives their parents had planned for them. The counterculture explosion was underway, fueled by music, politics, war opposition, and yes, by LSD. The question was no longer whether there would be a backlash. The question was how severe it would be, and what would be lost when it came. By 1963, LSD had escaped every attempt at containment. It was no longer confined to Swiss laboratories or CIA safe houses or Harvard research protocols. It was on the streets now, in the hands of artists and musicians and young people who saw in it not a psychiatric tool or a weapon, but a doorway to an entirely different way of experiencing reality. And nowhere was this transformation more visible than in San Francisco, where a rundown Victorian neighborhood called Haight-Ashbury was becoming the epicenter of a cultural revolution. But before Haight-Ashbury, before the Summer of Love, before LSD became synonymous with flower power and peace signs, there was Ken Kesey and his merry pranksters, and they had a very different vision of what psychedelics could be. Ken Kesey had first encountered LSD in 1959 as a volunteer in a government-funded study at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Menlo Park, California. He was a graduate student in the creative writing program at nearby Stanford University, earning extra money as a paid research subject. The study was part of the CIA's MKUltra program, though Kesey didn't know that at the time. What he did know was that the experience was unlike anything he had imagined. It opened perceptual doors, dissolved boundaries between self and world, and seemed to reveal truths that ordinary consciousness kept hidden. Kesey's experience with LSD directly influenced his writing of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, his 1962 novel about a psychiatric ward, where the inmates might be saner than their keepers, where rebellion against authority becomes a kind of sanity, and where the machinery of control is exposed as fundamentally inhuman. The book became a massive success, and Kesey used the money to buy a place in La Honda, California, where he gathered around him a group of friends and fellow travelers who became known as the Merry Pranksters, where Timothy Leary emphasized controlled set and setting, careful preparation, and guided experiences. Kesey believed in what might be called acid populism. His philosophy was that LSD shouldn't be restricted to therapeutic contexts or spiritual seekers or intellectual elites. If enough people took it, if it spread widely enough through the culture, it could transform society itself. The point wasn't to have a carefully managed mystical experience. The point was to break through the barriers of consensus reality and see what was on the other side. In 1964, Kesey and the pranksters embarked on a cross-country journey in a converted school bus they called Further, deliberately misspelled to suggest both further and future. The bus was painted in wild day-glow colors and equipped with cameras and recording equipment. The trip was an experiment in communal living and consciousness exploration, conducted largely while on LSD. Tom Wolfe would later chronicle the journey in his book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, capturing the chaotic energy and strange contradictions of the prankster philosophy. When they returned to California, Kesey began organizing events he called acid tests. The concept was simple in theory but revolutionary in practice. Gather a large group of people, provide them with LSD, turn on music, project light shows, and see what emerges. The posters advertising these events asked a single question: can you pass the acid test? There was no entry requirement, no screening process, no attempt to ensure people were prepared for the experience. The Grateful Dead provided the soundtrack, their improvisational style perfectly suited to the unpredictable nature of the events. The acid tests were chaotic, transformative, sometimes beautiful, sometimes terrifying, often both simultaneously. People who attended described them as unlike anything else. Not concerts, not parties, but something entirely new, an attempt to create temporary autonomous zones where normal rules didn't apply, and consciousness could be explored collectively. They were also, it must be said, potentially dangerous. Not everyone who took LSD at an acid test was prepared for the intensity of the experience, and there were bad trips, panic attacks, and psychological crises. But the acid tests succeeded in spreading LSD far beyond academic or therapeutic contexts. They demonstrated that psychedelic experience could be communal rather than individual, wild rather than controlled, anarchic rather than guided. And they helped establish the Grateful Dead as more than just a band. They became the musical embodiment of the psychedelic experience, their concerts evolving into quasi-religious gatherings where the distinction between performers and audience dissolved in a shared journey. The spread of LSD through the counterculture was facilitated by someone who would become a legend in his own right, Owsley Stanley, known simply as the Bear. Stanley was a self-taught chemist who had studied at the University of California at Berkeley. He tried LSD in the early 1960s and was frustrated by the inconsistent quality and purity of what was available. Most of the LSD circulating in California at that time came from various underground chemists whose product varied wildly in strength and cleanliness. Stanley decided to solve this problem himself. He set up his own laboratory and began producing LSD of extraordinarily high quality and purity. Owsley acid became the gold standard, the substance by which all other LSD was measured. After Sandoz stopped manufacturing and distributing LSD in 1965, Stanley's production became crucial to the psychedelic community. He created various formulations, including one called White Lightning that was 99% pure, as clean as LSD could possibly be. Stanley often distributed his LSD freely, believing that consciousness expansion was more important than profit. Estimates suggest he produced approximately 0.5 kilogram of LSD during his active years, enough for roughly 10 million doses. He supplied the acid tests, the Grateful Dead concerts, major gatherings like the Human Being in January 1967, and the Monterey International Pop Festival in June 1967. His generosity helped ensure that high-quality LSD was widely available during the peak years of the counterculture. Stanley also became the Grateful Dead's sound engineer and financial supporter, revolutionizing live sound reproduction and creating the foundation for what would become one of the most sophisticated concert sound systems in history. He designed the band's iconic lightning bolt skull logo and was the inspiration for the dancing bears that became another Dead symbol, Bear being his nickname. By the mid-1960s, LSD had thoroughly infiltrated music and art. The Beatles, having been introduced to the drug in 1965, began incorporating psychedelic influences into their work. Tomorrow Never Knows from Revolver, directly inspired by Timothy Leary's writings, featured tape loops, backwards recordings, and lyrics drawn from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds from Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Whether or not John Lennon's claim about his son's drawing was true, became inseparable from LSD in the public imagination. Jefferson Airplane's White Rabbit, with its explicit references to Alice in Wonderland as a metaphor for psychedelic experience, became an anthem. The Doors took their name from Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception. Pink Floyd's early work was heavily influenced by Syd Barrett's LSD use, a use that would eventually contribute to his psychological breakdown and departure from the band. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and countless others created music that seemed to emerge from and speak to the psychedelic experience. Visual artists created the iconic psychedelic aesthetic. Rick Griffin, Victor Moscoso, and Wes Wilson produced concert posters that seemed to breathe and move, their letters flowing into each other in ways that mimicked visual distortions common to LSD experiences. The posters advertised concerts, but were also works of art in themselves, using intense colors, intricate patterns, and deliberate visual ambiguity. Hawkett-Ashbury became the physical center of this cultural transformation. The neighborhood, with its affordable Victorian housing and proximity to Golden Gate Park, attracted young people from across America who were looking for alternatives to suburban conformity and conventional careers. Communes formed, free clinics opened, underground newspapers like the San Francisco Oracle spread the psychedelic gospel. The emphasis was on peace, love, and community, on rejecting materialism and embracing new forms of consciousness and social organization. But Haight-Ashbury's reality was more complicated than its ideals. Yes, there was genuine community and creativity and exploration, but there was also exploitation, predation, bad drugs, runaways fleeing abusive homes and finding different forms of abuse, people having psychotic breaks with no support systems to help them. The neighborhood's fame attracted not just idealistic seekers, but also opportunists, criminals, and people whose own psychological instability was magnified rather than healed by psychedelics. Albert Hofmann, watching from Switzerland as his problem child became a recreational drug and cultural symbol, was deeply distressed. This was not what he had envisioned when he first synthesized LSD-25. He had imagined careful therapeutic use, psychiatric research, controlled exploration of consciousness in clinical settings with trained professionals. Instead, he saw young people taking unknown doses in uncontrolled environments, treating his molecule as a party drug or a statement of rebellion rather than the serious tool he believed it to be. In writings and interviews, Hofmann expressed his disappointment. Since my self-experiment had revealed LSD in its terrifying demonic aspect, the last thing I could have expected was that this substance could ever find application as anything approaching a pleasure drug. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, how powerful and potentially dangerous LSD could be. His own first intentional experience had terrified him, and that had occurred in a context where he knew exactly what he had taken and had immediate access to medical care. The casual use of LSD at concerts and parties seemed to him not liberation but recklessness. The media discovered LSD around 1966, and the coverage was overwhelmingly negative. Time magazine, which had run positive reports on LSD in the 1950s, now warned about its dangers. Stories circulated, some true, many exaggerated or false, about people on LSD jumping out of windows thinking they could fly, staring at the sun until they went blind, experiencing flashbacks years after their last use. The exploitation film industry churned out movies like Hallucination Generation, The Trip, and Psych Out, sensationalizing psychedelic experiences for entertainment and moral panic purposes. Hospitals began reporting more emergency room visits from people having bad trips, panic attacks, paranoid episodes, psychological crises. Some of these were genuine reactions to LSD itself, but many were complicated by adulterants in street acid, by taking the drug in inappropriate settings without preparation, or by underlying psychological issues that LSD brought to the surface. The political dimension of LSD use became impossible to ignore. The counterculture wasn't just about consciousness exploration or artistic expression. It was about opposition to the Vietnam War, to racism, to conventional gender roles, to capitalism itself. LSD became associated with this broader challenge to American society. Young people who took LSD were often also protesting the war, questioning authority, rejecting the career, paths their parents had planned for them. For the establishment, this was intolerable. The government needed young men willing to accept being drafted and sent to Vietnam. It needed citizens who believed in American righteousness and didn't question foreign policy. It needed workers who would show up reliably and contribute to economic growth. Timothy Leary's message of turn on, tune in, drop out threatened all of that. If enough young people actually followed that advice, the entire social and economic system could become unstable. By late 1965 and early 1966, the backlash was building momentum. What had started as genuine concern about public health and safety was becoming intertwined with political control and cultural warfare. LSD wasn't being banned just because it was dangerous. Plenty of legal substances were more dangerous by any objective measure. It was being banned because of what it represented: rebellion, questioning of authority, rejection of the values that held American society together. The counterculture had made LSD central to its identity, and now that identity politics would have consequences. The molecule that Hofmann discovered, that the CIA tried to weaponize, that Leary promoted as a sacrament, and that Casey spread through acid tests, was about to become illegal. Not because anyone had proven it was particularly harmful in controlled settings, but because it had become too culturally powerful, too associated with movements that challenged the status quo. In San Francisco, in communes, and college dorms across America, people were experiencing what they believed to be profound insights about consciousness, society, and existence itself. Some of those insights were genuine. Some were the kind of pseudo-profundity that evaporates when the drug wears off. But the experience of having those perceptions, of feeling that one had touched something real beyond ordinary consciousness, was transformative for many people. The question, the culture faced, was whether that transformation would be allowed to continue and evolve, whether the insights would be integrated in healthy ways, whether the movement would mature beyond its rebellious adolescence into something sustainable. But that question would never be answered because prohibition was coming, and prohibition would drive everything underground, ending legitimate research and making it impossible to distinguish between the substance's actual effects and the mythology that grew up around it. The genie was out of the bottle, but the government was determined to force it back in, even if that meant crushing the bottle entirely. The genie had escaped, and now the desperate effort to force it back into the bottle began in earnest. But how do you make illegal something that thousands are already using, that respected researchers have studied for nearly 2 decades, that some psychiatrists genuinely believe has therapeutic value? The answer, it turned out, was to ignore the science, dismiss the research, and frame the issue entirely in terms of public safety and social order. Sandoz Laboratories was the first domino to fall. In 1965, after receiving requests from the US government expressing concern about LSD's growing recreational use, the Swiss pharmaceutical company stopped all shipments of the drug to the United States for research and psychiatric purposes. This was a remarkable decision. For nearly 20 years, Sandoz had been supplying Delicid to qualified researchers, supporting studies that had produced hundreds of published papers and shown genuine promise for treating conditions like alcoholism, anxiety, and depression. Now, because the drug had escaped the laboratory and entered the culture, all of that legitimate work was being shut down. The Food and Drug Administration followed quickly. In 1965, the FDA began demanding that researchers halt their LSD studies and return all their supplies of the drug. The official justification was patient safety, concerns that LSD might cause chromosome damage, birth defects, or long-term psychological harm. But many researchers suspected the real reason was political. The government wanted to send a message that LSD was dangerous, and it couldn't do that if respected medical institutions were simultaneously publishing papers about its therapeutic benefits. The easiest solution was to end the research entirely. Promising studies were terminated mid-course. Dr. Sidney Cohen, who had conducted some of the most careful and rigorous research on LSD's effects and safety profile in the 1950s, saw his work halted. Other researchers who had spent years developing protocols and accumulating data found their projects shut down with little explanation or recourse. Some complained that the FDA was less concerned with actual patient safety than with controlling public perception of the drug. At the state level, politicians rushed to be first to ban LSD. On May 30th, 1966, both California and Nevada passed laws making the manufacture, sale, and possession of LSD illegal. California Governor Edmund G. Brown, signing the bill into law, declared that LSD poses a growing threat to society, particularly to young thrill seekers unaware of the damage it can do. The rhetoric was about protection, but the urgency had more to do with politics. California was ground zero for the counterculture, and state officials were under pressure to do something about the perceived breakdown of social order in places like Haight-Ashbury. On October 6, 1966, the day California's ban took effect, nearly 1,000 people gathered in the panhandle of Golden Gate Park for what was called the Love Pageant Rally. It was not a protest in the traditional sense. There were no angry speeches demanding that the law be overturned. Instead, it was a celebration, a kind of wake for legal LSD. The Grateful Dead performed. People took acid openly, defiantly. The organizers, including Alan Cohen and Michael, Bowen from the San Francisco Oracle framed the event as opposition to the fear addiction of the general public as symbolized in this law. The date itself carried symbolic weight. October 6th, 1966, October 6th, 1966, could be rearranged to suggest 666, the number of the beast in the Book of Revelation. Whether or not this was intentional, it reflected the apocalyptic mood of the moment. The counterculture genuinely believed that consciousness expansion through psychedelics could transform humanity, could create a more peaceful and enlightened society. The prohibition of LSD felt like the forces of repression and fear, attempting to prevent human evolution itself. Other states quickly followed California's lead. By the end of 1966, LSD was illegal in most of the United States at the state level. But the federal government wanted comprehensive control. In 1966, Congress passed the Drug Abuse Control Amendment, which made the illegal manufacture and sale of LSD a federal crime. Interestingly, the initial legislation did not criminalize personal possession. You could have LSD, you just couldn't make it or sell it. This gap was closed in October 1968, when possession itself became a federal crime. The final nail in the coffin came in 1970 with the Controlled Substances Act, the comprehensive drug law passed under President Richard Nixon's administration. LSD was classified as a Schedule I substance, defined as having no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. This classification put it in the same category as heroin, despite decades of research suggesting that LSD was neither particularly addictive nor particularly dangerous when used in controlled settings. The Schedule I classification was devastating for research. By definition, Schedule I drugs have no currently accepted medical use, which makes it extraordinarily difficult to conduct the research that might demonstrate medical uses. It's a circular trap. The drug can't be researched because it has no medical use, and it can't be shown to have medical use because it can't be researched. In 1971, the United Nations Convention on Psychotropic Substances required all participating nations to prohibit LSD. Within a few years, the drug was illegal throughout most of Europe, ending the limited research that had continued there. Switzerland, perhaps because it was Hofmann's home country, continued to allow some controlled psychiatric use of LSD until 1993. But even there, the research eventually stopped. In 1974, the National Institute of Mental Health delivered what seemed like a final verdict. An NIMH research task force declared that there were no medical benefits associated with LSD. This conclusion ignored the hundreds of published studies from the previous 2 decades, many of which had shown promising results. But by 1974, the political and cultural climate made it impossible to acknowledge that LSD might actually be useful for anything. The decision had already been made, so Amit says, science just had to catch up. For Timothy Leary, prohibition meant persecution. His 1965 arrest in Texas for marijuana possession had resulted in an absurdly harsh sentence, 30 years in prison and a $30,000 fine. When he was arrested again in 1968 in California, also for marijuana, it became clear that the government was determined to make an example of him. After his appeals were exhausted and he was imprisoned in 1970, his dramatic escape with help from the Weather Underground And subsequent years as a fugitive only enhanced his legend, but also destroyed any remaining credibility he might have had as a scientific advocate for psychedelics. The irony was that prohibition made LSD more dangerous, not less. When the drug was legal and produced by pharmaceutical companies like Sandoz, users knew exactly what they were getting: pure LSD in precise doses. Once it became illegal and production moved to underground chemists, quality control disappeared. Street acid might be pure LSD, or it might be contaminated with other substances, or it might not be LSD at all, but some other compound being sold as acid. Doses varied wildly. There was no way for users to know what they were actually taking. The legal consequences were severe and often disproportionate. People caught with tiny amounts of LSD, sometimes just a few hits on blotter paper, faced years in prison. The war on drugs, which Nixon launched in 1971, treated drug users as criminals rather than as people who might need education or help. Mandatory minimum sentences meant that judges had little discretion to account for individual circumstances. Years later, John Ehrlichman, one of Nixon's top aides, would admit what many had suspected. The war on drugs was never really about drugs at all. In a 1994 interview, Ehrlichman explained, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." LSD prohibition was part of this larger strategy. It wasn't really about protecting public health. It was about controlling dissent, disrupting the counterculture, and maintaining the social order that the establishment depended upon. Despite the legal crackdown, LSD didn't disappear. Underground chemists continued to produce it. The Grateful Dead continued to attract crowds where acid was readily available. The culture that had formed around psychedelics persisted, though it became more cautious, more paranoid, more aware of the risks. But the openness was gone. The possibility of having honest public conversations about psychedelics, of distinguishing between responsible and irresponsible use, of learning from both the benefits and the dangers, all of that became impossible once everything was driven underground. The legitimate researchers whose careers were destroyed by prohibition could only watch in frustration. They had seen LSD help patients who hadn't responded to other treatments. They had accumulated data suggesting that carefully supervised psychedelic therapy could produce lasting positive changes for people suffering from alcoholism, anxiety, and existential distress. Now all of that work was not just stopped, but actively suppressed. Albert Hofmann lived to be 102 years old, dying in 2008. In his later years, he wrote and spoke about his problem child with a mixture of sadness and hope. He maintained that LSD should be regulated like morphine, a powerful substance that requires controls, but that can be valuable in the right contexts. He argued for spiritual and therapeutic use under proper supervision. He was disappointed by casual recreational use, but he was equally disappointed by the prohibition that prevented serious research and therapeutic application. In his 1979 book, LSD, My Problem Child, Hofmann reflected on what had happened to his discovery. He understood that the substance had genuine power to expand consciousness and provide insights. But he also recognized that power requires wisdom, that set and setting matter enormously, that some people are psychologically unsuited for psychedelic experiences. He believed that outright prohibition was a mistake, that it threw away potential benefits out of fear. By the late 1970s, with Leary in prison and then released, with the counterculture fragmenting or maturing into other forms, with LSD illegal worldwide and research at a standstill, it seemed like the story might be over. The psychedelic revolution had failed. The establishment had won. LSD would be remembered as a footnote to the 1960s, a cautionary tale about what happens when chemistry meets counterculture. But molecules are patient. They don't care about politics or cultural trends or moral panics. They simply exist, waiting for the moment when humans might be ready to approach them with more wisdom. And in laboratories and clinics around the world, few determined researchers were already thinking about how they might, someday, restart the research that had been so abruptly ended. The door wasn't closed, it was only locked, and eventually, someone would find the key. LSD did not disappear after prohibition. It couldn't disappear. The knowledge of how to synthesize it existed in chemistry textbooks and in the minds of trained chemists. The cultural memory of what it could do persisted in music, art, and the stories people told about their experiences. And most importantly, the questions it had raised about consciousness, about the nature of reality, about the limits of human perception. Those questions didn't go away just because the government declared the substance illegal. Through the 1980s and 1990s, LSD use continued, though it became less visible and less central to any particular cultural movement. The Grateful Dead continued to tour until Jerry Garcia's death in 1995, and their concerts remained places where LSD was readily available and widely used. The jam band scene that emerged in the Dead's wake, Fish, String Cheese Incident, and others, inherited this aspect of the culture, along with the improvisational musical style. Raves and electronic music festivals in the 1990s created new contexts for psychedelic use, though MDMA and other substances often overshadowed LSD. The drug's cultural presence diminished but never vanished entirely. By the early 2000s, surveys showed that LSD use was at historic lows. MDMA, mushrooms, and ayahuasca, the traditional South American brew that had gained popularity among seekers, had all eclipsed LSD in popularity. It seemed like the substance might fade into obscurity, remembered mainly as a relic of the 1960s. But something else was happening quietly, away from public attention. In Silicon Valley, among programmers and engineers, a different kind of LSD culture was emerging. Microdosing, taking doses far below the threshold for full psychedelic effects, typically around 10 to 20 micrograms, began to spread through the tech industry. Users reported enhanced creativity, better problem-solving abilities, improved focus. Whether these effects were real or placebo was unclear, but the practice gained adherence. This was LSD, stripped of countercultural associations, reframed as a tool for productivity and innovation in the world's most capitalist industry. More significantly, a few determined researchers had never given up on the idea that psychedelics might have legitimate therapeutic value. The prohibition had stopped research in the United States, but it hadn't erased the hundreds of studies from the 1950s and 1960s, showing promising results. Those papers still existed in medical libraries, waiting for anyone brave or stubborn enough to read them and wonder whether the research might be restarted. In Switzerland, psychiatrist Peter Gasser began working toward that goal. In 2007, after years of navigating regulatory obstacles, he launched a small study on the use of LSD for anxiety in patients with life-threatening diseases. The study was carefully designed with multiple safeguards. Gasser's first goal wasn't even to prove therapeutic benefit. It was simply to demonstrate that LSD could be safely administered to patients in a modern clinical setting with proper protocols. The results, published in 2014, were cautiously encouraging. Patients who received a full 200 microgram dose of LSD in combination with psychotherapy showed reductions in anxiety averaging 20%, and these improvements lasted for up to a year. Equally important, there were no serious adverse events. The study proved that with proper screening, preparation, and support, LSD could be used in therapy without the horror stories that had dominated media coverage decades earlier. Around the same time, researchers at the University of Basel, including Matthias Liechti, began conducting studies on LSD's effects in healthy volunteers. Using modern brain imaging technology that hadn't existed in the 1960s, they could actually see what LSD did in the brain. The research revealed that LSD increased communication between brain regions that don't normally interact, breaking down the barriers that usually keep different neural networks separate. This might explain the sense of boundary dissolution, the synesthesia, the feeling of cosmic connection that users reported. Other research groups began quantifying effects that psychedelic users had described anecdotally for decades. Studies documented ego dissolution, the temporary loss of the sense of self as a separate entity. Researchers measured how LSD affected emotional responses to music, finding that it dramatically increased the emotional impact of songs. Brain imaging showed how the drug altered visual processing in ways that correlated with the geometric patterns and color intensification people experienced. This new wave of research was markedly different from the 1960s work. The modern studies used rigorous double-blind protocols, careful screening of participants, standardized questionnaires to measure effects, brain imaging to understand mechanisms, and long-term follow-up to assess lasting impacts. Where Timothy Leary had often combined research with advocacy, making grand claims that outpaced the evidence, the new generation of psychedelic researchers were scrupulously careful in their language, limiting their conclusions to what the data actually supported. Rick Doblin, founder of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, described the modern research as an attempt to break these substances out of the mold of the counterculture and bring them back to the lab as part of a psychedelic renaissance. The goal was to separate the compounds from the cultural and political baggage they had accumulated, to study them as medicines rather than as symbols of rebellion. At Johns Hopkins University, researchers began studying psilocybin for depression and end-of-life anxiety, producing results so compelling that the FDA eventually granted psilocybin breakthrough therapy designation. At Imperial College London, scientists examined how psychedelics might help treat addiction and depression by disrupting rigid patterns of thought. The research created momentum, making it easier for other institutions to justify launching their own studies. As research resumed, people who had kept their psychedelic use private for decades began to speak out. Using social media campaigns like #psychedelics, because Users shared stories of how LSD and other psychedelics had helped them overcome depression, process trauma, enhance creativity, or find meaning. The harsh mandatory minimum sentences of the drug war era were fading into the past, and the risks of being publicly associated with psychedelic use were diminishing. This public advocacy borrowed explicitly from LGBTQ rights activism, the idea of coming out of the psychedelic closet, of making visible a community that had always existed but had remained hidden. Some critics argued that this comparison was offensive, that choosing to use a drug was fundamentally different from sexual orientation or gender identity. But advocates pointed out that for many people, psychedelic experiences had been central to their spiritual development and worldview, and that being forced to hide this aspect of their lives was genuinely painful. The growing acceptance led to real policy changes. In November 2020, Oregon became the first U.S. state to decriminalize possession of small amounts of all drugs, including LSD, through ballot measure 110. The measure didn't legalize the drugs or establish a regulated market, but it removed criminal penalties for possession, treating it instead as a civil violation similar to a traffic ticket. Other jurisdictions, including several cities and counties, began considering similar approaches. Meanwhile, LSD use was actually increasing after decades of decline. Data showed that use among U.S. adults increased by over 56% between 2015 and 2018. About 10% of Americans had used LSD at some point in their lives, and about 0.7% had used it in the past year. The increases were sharpest among people over 26, suggesting that this wasn't just youthful experimentation, but something more sustained. The cultural rehabilitation of psychedelics was reflected in mainstream media as well. Major publications ran articles about Silicon Valley executives microdosing for productivity. Celebrities spoke openly about their psychedelic experiences and how those experiences had shaped their creative work or personal growth. The Netflix documentary Have a Good Trip featured celebrities discussing their LSD experiences with humor and insight rather than shame or secrecy. The conversation was changing, yet LSD remained a Schedule I controlled substance under federal law. The contradiction was stark. Respected institutions were publishing peer-reviewed research showing potential therapeutic benefits. States were decriminalizing possession. Mainstream culture was becoming more accepting. But the federal government's official position was still that LSD had no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. This created real obstacles for research. Scientists had to navigate Byzantine regulatory processes to obtain Schedule I substances and permission to study them. Funding was difficult to secure. Universities were often reluctant to associate themselves with psychedelic research for fear of controversy or reputational risk. The research proceeded, but slowly, far more slowly than it might have if LSD were regulated like other powerful psychiatric medications. The questions that Albert Hofmann had wondered about in his Basel laboratory were finally being investigated with modern tools and modern scientific rigor. What are the therapeutic applications? How does the substance work in the brain? What are the risks and how can they be minimized? Who benefits most and who should avoid it? What role do set and setting play in shaping outcomes? But running parallel to these practical questions were deeper, more philosophical ones. What does it mean that a molecule can so profoundly alter consciousness? What does the psychedelic experience reveal about the nature of mind and reality? Are the insights people have while on LSD genuine insights or chemically induced illusions? Can a drug experience be legitimately spiritual, or is that a category error? These questions have no easy answers, and perhaps no final answers. Different people who take LSD have radically different experiences and draw radically different conclusions. Some come away convinced they've touched ultimate reality. Others view it as a fascinating neurochemical phenomenon that reveals how the brain constructs what we call consciousness. But that doesn't necessarily tell us anything true about the external world. Both groups might be right, or both might be wrong, or the question itself might be improperly framed. What seems clear from the vantage point of 2026 is that LSD is not going away. The knowledge exists, the molecule exists, the human drive to explore consciousness exists. The only real question is whether that exploration will happen in legal, regulated, researched contexts with proper safeguards, or whether it will continue happening in underground, uncontrolled settings where risks are higher and learning is limited. The history of LSD from 1938 to the present is, in many ways, a history of missed opportunities. What if the CIA had never tried to weaponize it? What if Timothy Leary had been more responsible in his advocacy? What if the government had regulated it carefully rather than prohibiting it entirely? What if research had continued uninterrupted from the 1950s to the present? How many people might have been helped? How much might we understand about consciousness that we don't currently understand? But history doesn't offer do-overs. We have the history we have, with all its wrong turns and wasted decades. The question now is what comes next. The current moment feels, in some ways, like a second chance. The research is restarting. The cultural conversation is reopening. There's an opportunity to approach LSD and other psychedelics with more wisdom than previous generations brought to them, to acknowledge both the potential benefits and the real risks, to do careful research rather than making wild claims, to regulate rather than prohibit, to learn from both the successes and the failures of the past. Albert Hofmann, in his final years, maintained his belief that LSD could be a tool to turn us into what we are supposed to be. He envisioned it as an aid to spiritual development, a catalyst for the kind of consciousness shift that humanity might need to address the challenges of the modern world. But he was also clear that the tool required wisdom to use properly, that set and setting were crucial, that not everyone was suited for the experience. Before Hofmann died in 2008, at the age of 102, he had seen his molecule go through multiple transformations, from laboratory curiosity to psychiatric tool, to CIA weapon, to cultural symbol, to prohibited substance, to finally the subject of renewed legitimate research. He had lived long enough to see the beginning of what some were calling the psychedelic renaissance, though he didn't live to see how far that renaissance might go. The story that began on that April afternoon in 1943, when a Swiss chemist accidentally absorbed a molecule and took a bicycle ride that changed history, is still unfolding. New chapters are being written in research laboratories, in therapy rooms, in policy debates, and in the experiences of individuals who continue to explore consciousness through LSD despite its illegal status. What we know now, what 8 decades of history have taught us, is that LSD is neither the panacea its most enthusiastic advocates claimed, nor the social poison its prohibitionist opponents feared. It's a powerful tool that can be used well or badly, that can help or harm depending on context and approach. That reveals something profound about the malleability of human consciousness. But that doesn't come with an instruction manual or a guarantee of enlightenment. The molecule remains patient and neutral, waiting to see whether humans have finally learned enough wisdom to match its power. The next chapter of the story is being written now, by researchers conducting careful studies, by therapists exploring new treatment protocols, by policymakers reconsidering prohibition, and by individuals making their own decisions about consciousness and experience. Good evening. We began this journey in a Basel laboratory with Albert Hofmann and a peculiar presentiment. We traveled through CIA safe houses and Harvard halls, through Haight-Ashbury streets and decades of prohibition to arrive at this moment of tentative renaissance. One molecule, synthesized almost by accident, that governments tried to weaponize, that a generation claimed as sacrament, that created both wonder and chaos, insight and delusion, healing and harm. The history of LSD is ultimately a human history, a story of our capacity for both wisdom and folly, our endless fascination with consciousness, our tendency to see what we want to see, our ability to learn from mistakes, though it sometimes takes us decades to do so. Whatever you think about LSD, its history reveals us to ourselves, our fears, our hopes, our need for control, our desire for freedom, our eternal search for meaning in a universe that doesn't provide easy answers. The door that Hofmann opened in 1943 remains open. The question isn't whether people will continue to walk through it. The question is whether this time we've learned enough to do so with our eyes open, with proper preparation, with respect for both the power and the limits of what we might find on the other side. The story continues, unfinished, waiting to see what we make of it.